Let's get down to writing a serious program. We'll write a program to prompt a user for a URL and we'll download the URL from the internet. It'll have a while loop so that we can continue as long as the user wants to keep going. We'll prompt the user for a URL to download. And we'll also ask them for a handy name for that URL so that we can store it. Now, since we are in a while loop, we need a way to break out of the loop. So we'll use an if statement. If the user enters a blank URL, we'll break out of the loop. So whenever the user enters blank, this loop will just stop running. So if the user has not entered a blank URL, he wants us to download the URL. So we'll download it and store it in a dictionary. The dictionary will have a key value pair put into it. The key will be the name that the user has entered and the value will be whatever we downloaded for the URL. We'll enclose all of this in a try except block. What is this? We've not really seen this before. Whenever an error occurs, you don't want the program to stop running. So wherever there is a possibility of an error, enclose that part of the code in a try block and then tell the program what to do if an error occurs in the except block. So if an error occurs, we'll prompt the user to stop or proceed. If the user says stop, we'll break out of the loop. So this will break us out of the entire loop completely. Else, if the user says continue, we'll go ahead and we will go back to the beginning of our program or the beginning of our loop where we say prompt the user for a new URL to download. We've talked about modules and how you can import code that other people have written before. This will be super useful in this particular exercise because URL-lib is a very cool library which allows you to download a URL with a very simple piece of code. Now, getting other people's libraries to work in IPython or Python can be a bit daunting, but just use this command, pip. Just type in !pip install followed by the module or library name and it should install the library for you directly and any dependencies that library needs. Here XLSX writer is the name of the module. You'll want to install urllib2 for our particular exercise. If you've done an Anaconda install, the way we showed you how to do, you don't even need to go through any of this because most of the libraries that you'll use are already installed for you. The first time you use a library on a particular machine, that's when you have to do this pip install. Once you've done that, you can just import it directly. So let's go ahead and write a couple of import statements. We'll import urllib2 and sys. These are a couple of libraries that will be useful. urllib2 for downloading a URL and sys so that you can capture errors. Import statements allow us to use modules or libraries which are code written by other people. Imagine how cool that is. You don't have to know exactly what code is required to download a URL, how browsers work, how web pages talk to each other. Just get this library and use the commands in this library to download a URL. That's why modules are super cool. What we'll do first is set up a dummy URL. We won't actually use this, but because of the way our while loop is set up, remember how we said that the while loop will continue as long as the URL is not blank. We need to initialize our URL with a dummy value, because if it's a blank, then our while loop will not even start. You will generally see this whenever we set up a while loop. It will need a dummy value to work right the first time. Let's now set up a dictionary. Crawled web links. We'll initialize it as an empty dictionary where we'll keep adding the key value pairs of the URL name and the downloaded contents as the user keeps entering the URLs to download. So let's say the user enters a URL www.google.com and gives us a short name Google. We'll basically store these as key value pairs in our dictionary. This will keep track of all the URLs that we have downloaded and parsed. So here's our while loop coming up now. We've done the basic setup, we imported the libraries and initialized the variables that we need. While URL to read not equal to, that is denoted by exclamation mark equal to blank. Pay attention to this. URL to read not equal to blank is basically a condition that the while loop will keep checking. As long as this condition is true, the loop will continue. Whenever this condition becomes false, that is if the URL to read is a blank URL, the while loop will stop. Next, we enclose all of the rest of the code in a try block. So all the code where we ask the user for something and then do an action basis that, we'll enclose it in a try block. How do we say that it's enclosed? The indentation has changed. That is how you know that all of this code is inside the try block. Similarly, the try block is also indented, so all of this is inside the while loop. There's a reason we are enclosing everything in the try block. If there is an error, which is quite possible, the user might enter some malformed URLs, and then when you try to download it, the web page might throw some error. If that happens, you don't want your program to stop or throw an error. It will just look really bad. So you want the program to know what to do when an error is thrown. So it will try all the code which is in the try block, and if an error is thrown, it will fall into the except block, which we will write later. So here we're doing something pretty straightforward. We're asking the user to input the next URL to be crawled. We check if this is a blank, because the user knows that if he enters blank, he or she is indicating that they want to stop. If the URL to read is blank, we'll print that we are exiting the loop and break out of the while loop. On the other hand, if it is not blank, we'll continue on and we'll ask the user to enter a short name for the URL. Okay, here's the crucial bit that actually does the downloading. Web file equals urllib2.urlopen url to read.read. So what are we doing here? Web file is where we're storing the downloaded URL contents. We're downloading them using a ready-made function in the urllib2 module. This is the URL open function. It's super cool. We downloaded the URL with one line of code. It just takes a URL, it goes to the website for that URL, downloads it and reads the contents and puts it in the variable that we asked it to put it. The contents will be in the form of an HTML, which is then converted into a string. So web file will actually be a string, which is all the HTML corresponding to that web page. So now let's store this in our dictionary that we set up. So we'll add a key value pair to our crawled web links dictionary. The key will be the short name that the user gave us, and the value will be this HTML string that we got by downloading the URL. So if all goes well, this is all you needed. You just needed to ask the user for an input or the URL name that you need to download it, add it to the dictionary. But if all doesn't go well, if the user enters a malformed URL or some error happens while you're downloading the page, this is quite possible, you want to know what to do. So then we fall into the except block. So enclosing your code in try except blocks and basically telling your code beforehand how to handle any errors or exceptions that happen is really important part of programming, and it's an example of something known as exception handling. We'll talk more about this in another class. So the first thing you want to do when an error happens is to print something to the screen to indicate that an error has occurred, so that the user knows, okay, something has happened and maybe you want them to do something. So let's print an error message to the screen. So sys.execInfo here is a function from the sys module. Remember how we imported this module when we started out? This module helps us to basically understand what's going on with the program or what's going on in the background. So sys.execInfo will print the error to the screen, whatever the error it has encountered. Again, see how magical that was? Just by having the sys library, you can print an error to the screen without really knowing how to deal with OSs yourself. Now we'll ask for an input from the user. We'll tell the user an error has occurred. What do you want us to do? Should I stop or should I proceed? If you want me to stop, enter 1. Enter anything else if you want me to continue. So this will open up a prompt box and wait for the user to enter something. We'll just check what the user has entered, and if they have entered 1, that means they want us to stop. So we'll print okie dokie stopping, and we will break out of our while loop. So that will stop the program and we won't ask the user for any more URLs to download. Remember, the break command breaks out of the nearest loop, which in this case is a while loop. If you had a nested loop, that is a loop inside a loop, then it would break out of the innermost loop. Okay, if the user has not entered 1, that means they want us to continue. So we'll print a message saying that we are going on and continue. The continue command will basically skip out of this current iteration of the loop and take you to the next iteration. So it will go back to the beginning of the while loop and again ask the user for a URL to enter. Basically, just resetting to the start. So you've been noticing how we've been indenting all our code. This is something which is very peculiar to Python. If you want to say that this code is enclosed inside this if statement or else statement or any particular block, or this code is enclosed inside a loop, you have to basically indent your code. So this particular code we are writing is actually inside the while loop. The indentation indicates that it's inside the while loop, but it is outside our try-catch block. Next, we'll change the indentation. This statement is outside the while loop completely. So you'll notice when we keep running the program that every time we download a URL, every time the while loop runs, the first line will show up, but this last line will only show up once we are done and we have completely finished out our program. Next, we'll just print to screen what are all the links that we have downloaded. So we'll print a list of the keys of our crawled web links dictionary where we've been keeping track of all the URLs that we downloaded. Wasn't that a lot of code? You should be feeling proud of yourself. Now, if we hit Shift Enter here, this code should execute the way we expect it to. Let's give it a try. Don't worry if it throws an error. Just go back and debug what your code looks like. Cool. So we've got an input. Let's enter a URL here. www.google.com. We'll give it a name. Google. Remember, if you're using Python 2, to enclose that in double quotes. Cool. It printed that line that's inside the while loop but outside the try catch block, which means it successfully downloaded the URL. Next, we entered some malformed url.com. Basically, it's a URL that doesn't exist. An error was thrown. Notice how we got an exception value error. It asked us whether to stop or proceed. We said we'll proceed, so we are continuing on. Now, let's say we enter nytimes.com. See, I forgot to enclose nytimes in quotes. This is why there was an error. I'll try that again. So let's enter nytimes.com as the URL. We're enclosing that in quotes. And again, nytimes as the short name, enclosing it in quotes. Okay, I'm done now. So we'll enter blank so that it should stop. So it printed nytimes and Google as the links that we have downloaded.